Okay, just to go back to the 14th Amendment, the due process, equal protection, that was the basis of the Brown versus Board decision in the 50s that desegregated schools. It was the decision of many of the civil rights, the Supreme Court civil rights cases of the 1960s. Just a very, very, one of the most significant amendments to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, and it comes out of the Civil War. Okay, so Congress passes this amendment. The Republicans, moderates and radicals, come together and pass this amendment, send it out to the states, and although Confederate states were not allowed to send senators to Washington or members of the House of Representatives, they still were able to vote on the 14th Amendment. So what's happening is states, Confederate states, are still in limbo. They have some political rights. They can vote on the 14th Amendment, but in other ways they don't have rights. They don't have two senators. They don't have members of the House in Washington. But to cut to the chase, Texas gets to vote on the 14th Amendment, Tennessee, Louisiana, all the Confederate states. And what the Confederate states do is they reject it. They reject the 14th Amendment. They refuse to pass it. So it doesn't reach, it's not going to reach the 3/4 of the states that are required to make it a constitutional amendment. Okay, so just to go over this one more time, Congress passes the 14th Amendment in the summer of '66. I've talked at great length about the significance of it and what it meant for African Americans, equal protection of the law, due process, citizenship, etc. This proposal, Congress's proposal, this amendment to the Constitution, goes to the states. It passes northern states, but it doesn't pass southern states. The southern states reject it. And this is something else that lends to the backlash in the North in the fall of 1866, that southern states looked at the 14th Amendment, knew what it meant for African Americans, knew that it granted them citizenship rights, and they said no. Okay? And so we're at loggerheads. We're at loggerheads. Then what happens is, I talked about 2 podcasts ago, Congress, Republicans in Congress, radicals and moderates, gain a veto-proof majority in the election of 1866. And in 1867, when this Congress meets, they're able to do what they want without worrying about Andrew Johnson vetoing any of their legislation. So what they do is they're very, very angry at the South for rejecting the 14th Amendment. They're furious at the South for rejecting the 14th Amendment. So what Congress does when it meets in 1867, it says it passes what are called Reconstruction Acts. And the Reconstruction Acts, I'll bring it up a map here real quickly. What Congress, basically, Congress is fed up with the white South by the winter of 1867. When the Congress that has a veto-proof majority convenes in 1867, they're fed up with the white South. They're fed up with Andrew Johnson. They have a veto-proof majority. And what Congress does is passes Reconstruction Acts. And what they do is they put the states of the South under military rule, which is pretty extraordinary if you think about it. So the states of the South in 1867, the ex-Confederate states in particular, lose their civilian rule and come under, through congressional legislation, military rule. And this is when you have U.S. troops going into states of the South and registering African Americans, registering them to vote at the point of a bayonet. And this is one of the things that the Birth of a Nation showed, what I showed you guys Monday. Just the outrage of the white South that the U.S. Army would come into the ex-Confederate states and protect African Americans as they registered to vote under the 14th Amendment. And this is considered one of the great sins of Reconstruction. This idea that the vindictive North was coming down and wreaking vengeance on a helpless Southern white population. I have a very, very different take on it. My take on it is that African Americans were Americans. Males did have the right to vote as much as white males did. Black males had the right to vote. That the local southern states, the ex-Confederate states, were trying to stymie the ability of white males over the age of 21 to vote. And that it took the U.S. Army to come into the southern states to protect African Americans, to give them the vote, or it would have never happened because of the deep, deep racism in the South. So what we have is that African Americans do begin registering to vote beginning in the summer of 1867 under the protection of the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army has gone into the states of the South. In some sense, you might say that they've occupied the states of the South. And now they're forcing southern states to recognize the citizenship rights of African Americans and the voting rights of African Americans. So it's at this point that African American males gain the right to vote, and they gain the right to vote under the protection of the U.S. Army. And as you saw on Monday, if you were in class, this is something that really completely enraged Southern whites. That the U.S. Army was coming into the South, was denying the South civilian rule, and was registering African Americans to vote under the protection of the U.S. Army. Now, there were never like hundreds of thousands of U.S. Army troops in the South. It was only a few thousand at most. But still, it's a remarkable moment in U.S. history where Congress basically orders the U.S. Army into the states of the ex-South to protect African Americans as they registered to vote. Very, very interesting moment in U.S. history. And it's what you're starting to see is that the full implications, the full revolutionary implications of the Civil War are starting to become realized with the registration of African Americans to vote under the protection of the U.S. Army. Remember, African Americans had no citizenship rights at all after the Dred Scott decision. And then just about 10 years later, African Americans are gaining the right to vote, albeit under very, very unusual circumstances, under the protection of the U.S. Army, under the protection of the national government. So this is just truly an amazing moment in U.S. history as African Americans gain the right to vote. Now, very, very quickly, the Congressional War with Andrew Johnson comes to a head. Radical Republicans try to impeach and throw Johnson out of the office of the presidency. They come very close, but they fail. But in some ways, it becomes a moot point in 1868 when our old buddy U.S. Grant is elected president. So after 1868, the Republicans in Congress have a much friendlier president in U.S. Grant than they had in Andrew Johnson. So what you have is, as I said before, beginning in 1867 into 1868, African Americans under the protection of the U.S. Army gain the right to vote. And this is one of the aspects of Reconstruction that still to this day enrages many Confederate apologists.